Welcome to this first part of 2 videos on diagramming arguments. This will be a very focused video lecture explaining how to do a fundamental step in critical thinking called simple reasoning. Last week you began working through what components make an argument, and all of you are at the very least starting to make sense of a concept called logical flow. As a reminder, logical flow is a concept that refers to how an argument moves in a step-by-step way, where each statement naturally leads to the next. If you were to describe what this looks like visually, you can represent it by putting an argument into something called standard form. Here, the premises are numbered with the conclusion at the very bottom, represented by the symbol C. This is the basic way that you would represent an argument whenever you have one or more premises that logically flow into a conclusion. So theoretically, you can take any argument that you hear or see and represent it using some variation of this standard format, as long as the logical flow of the argument moves in a linear step-by-step way all the way down to its conclusion. But what if the logical flow of an argument isn't so linear? Let's take one of the articles that I randomly found online as an example. In the beginning of this article, the author writes the following: a new report from the Pew Research Center finds Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States, bringing renewed attention to the growing economic and political power of Asian communities. Between 2000 and 2019, the Asian population grew 81%. Now this over here, Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States. This proposition, this is the conclusion. Now, which of these propositions are the premises? While you're looking for premises, you should also remove sentences that have nothing to do with the argument. These propositions over here, they all directly relate to the argument. In fact, they don't just relate to the argument, they support the conclusion. So we know that these propositions, they're premises. But this here, it's just a sentence. We can ignore it completely since this sentence has nothing to do with the rest of the propositions. It's not part of the argument. This week, you'll be learning a specific tool for critical thinking that will allow you to physically demonstrate the logical flow in an argument without having to put the argument in standard form. And we call this tool diagramming. This week, you're going to learn how to diagram arguments. Diagramming helps us to see how ideas are connected. It also helps us to avoid confusion when arguments include extra language or emotion. This is especially useful when analyzing complicated debates or trying to make sense of statistical information like you see here about Asian Americans. And we're going to start by learning how to diagram something called simple arguments. Now pay attention to this, they're called simple arguments, not because they're easy, but because they involve just one step of reasoning. Simple arguments use one premise to support the conclusion. According to the argument in front of you, one premise, just one, leads to the conclusion. It's just one step. So this is an example of a simple argument. Each time you approach an argument, I suggest that you go through each of these 5 steps. I'll do my best to explain each step clearly so that you get a really good sense of why you're doing what you're doing when you're trying to diagram any kind of argument. Before you even start separating an argument into its parts or its components, you have to begin by trying to understand the topic of the argument and what's the point that's being made, its conclusion. Going back to this argument, the person making this argument is saying two things. But if you read this more closely, you'll see that the rest of the propositions, they're all responding and supporting just one of these two parts of this sentence. So after reading this argument, you'll see that it isn't trying to focus on this part. It's not trying to prove that there's renewed attention to the growing economic and political power of Asian communities. It's trying to prove that this report, that it finds that Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial or ethnic group in the United States. So that's what we need to focus on understanding. This here is the point of the argument, not this. What you'll quickly realize is that when you're trying to figure out what's the point of an argument, your brain is automatically doing steps 2 and 3 at the same time. You're looking for the conclusion, and at the same time, you're trying to weed out what are the premises. The conclusion, it's the main claim. Look for indicator terms like therefore, so, or this shows that. Everything else is either a reason or just background context, things that you don't need in order to prove the argument. Ask yourself, which proposition is justifying, supporting the other proposition? If this statement is trying to give justification for this statement, then it's the premise. And this has to be the conclusion. You'll already see that by doing steps 1 and 3, you're also implicitly doing step number 4. When you see an argument, it's important that you try very hard to ignore background stories, statements that are trying to give you context, or any kind of emotionally charged assertions that aren't really trying to support the conclusion. Instead, focus only on the reasoning that's being provided to you. Okay, now that you have a better idea of what you think are the premises and what you think is the conclusion, you can start diagramming. But here's a really important part of diagramming. When you diagram arguments, you're only going to use 2 symbols. The first is the arrow symbol. This symbol not only shows which statements are the premises and which is the conclusion, but it points in the direction of the logical flow of the argument. One idea needs to be first in order to lead into another idea, and that idea then leads into another idea. This symbol, it shows how all of the premises are needed in order for them to logically flow into the conclusion. When you diagram, you always place the arrow in the direction of the conclusion. So it doesn't actually matter if the conclusion starts up here or it starts down here. You'll always know where the conclusion is because the arrow or arrows are always pointing to the conclusion. The other symbol that you'll be using is the plus symbol, but don't worry about that for now. For now, you're just working with simple arguments. And for simple arguments, you just need to be sure that you're doing 2 things. The first is to know which proposition is the premise and which one is the conclusion. Then you use an arrow to indicate which one is which.